and welcome. I'm Ken Marotte, a historical researcher for the Citrus County Historical Society, and welcome to Stories from the Vault. I'm here in the vaults of the Old Courthouse Heritage Museum in Inverness, and today we'll look at one of the most enduring legends about Citrus County, and Homosassa in particular. I'm referring to the local myths about the contributions that President Grover Cleveland made in the development of that town. Let's review some of the stories we've been told. From the Tampa Bay Times of February 16, 1926, the Rendezvous Inn at Homosassa was originally built by the late John Jacob Astor, and on several occasions Grover Cleveland was his guest. That same edition said that the Florida West Coast Development Company has the original plans of Grover Cleveland, who visioned that city would someday transform into the ideal settling as a thriving metropolis. The Tampa Bay Times a couple weeks later said old Homosassa Village, where Grover Cleveland dreamed dreams of the great port and recreational city that was to be. A week later, the Tampa Bay Times said Grover Cleveland often visited Homosassa on his fishing and hunting hunts, where he enjoyed both the freshwater and deep sea angling. Then, joining friends on a hunting expedition, he brought down many a duck in the jungle-covered banks of the Homosassa River, it is said. Later, 6 months later, the stories got even more complex. The Tampa Tribune in December of 1926 said that the Rendezvous was made nationally known as the headquarters for the late Grover Cleveland and the late Joe Jefferson on many fishing expeditions to this part of Florida. Tampa Bay Times in 1941 continued the legend. Grover Cleveland was an enthusiastic fisherman who came to Homosassa, Florida every year with Joe Jefferson, the famous actor. The two fished for a month or two and then returned to their work. Finally, in 1945, while the war is still going on, World War II, Grover Cleveland, while president and thereafter, was a frequent visitor, attracted by the marvelous fishing. He and his friends built a fishing lodge, which still stands. Cleveland and a small group of friends planned and laid out the old town of Homosassa near the river mouth. We even have Grover Cleveland Boulevard in Homosassa, so named to honor the legacy of the former president. Most people in Citrus County assume that all of this is true, but is it? Let's look further. So let's look at who is Grover Cleveland anyway. Grover Cleveland had a meteoric rise in American politics that no one, especially Cleveland himself, could have predicted. He was not an especially ambitious guy, but he was so honest that people said that he had a spine of steel. He was a resident of Buffalo, New York, where during the Civil War, as was the custom for many well-to-do citizens, he paid a $300 bounty to avoid being drafted into military service. He was active in local politics in New York City. He especially liked to congregate in taverns in that city. Dozens of bars claimed him as a regular customer, and they were all telling the truth. He loved outdoor sports and belonged to several hunting and fishing clubs there. So, Grover Cleveland loved outdoor sports and was well known as a fisherman. It's said that if there was a mud puddle, you would find Grover Cleveland fishing in it. He was so popular that he was elected mayor of Buffalo in 1880. Then in New York State, when the Democratic Party was looking for a candidate for governor in 1882, he was elected governor of New York State. And he was really developed a reputation for honesty. Short 2 years later, the Democrats had not elected a president since before the Civil War. The Republicans had a lock on the White House. But Cleveland was nominated to be the Democratic candidate in 1884. He was a reformer, but he had a potential scandal brewing. Both he and his law partner, Oscar Folsom, allegedly enjoyed the company of a woman, Maria Halpin, who bore a son out of wedlock in 1874. Remember that name, Oscar Folsom, because it becomes important later on in the story. When he was asked by his campaign staff how to respond, Cleveland said, "Always tell the truth. The boy could be mine, I don't know." He offered to support the boy. In the pre-Maury Povich era, when you really couldn't tell you are the father, allegedly even Mrs. Halpern couldn't tell which man was the father. So she named him Oscar Folsom Cleveland, after both possible fathers, according to some accounts. The real truth is up for debate today. Needless to say, the Republicans made political capital by mercilessly chanting, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" during their campaign rallies in 1884. But their strategy backfired. The voters admired the honesty that Grover Cleveland exhibited. When he won the election of 1884, his supporters celebrated with their own chant, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa? Gone to the White House, ha ha ha." In less than 5 years, Grover Cleveland had gone from local personality to President of the United States. So back to Oscar Folsom. He had died in a carriage accident in 1875. Grover Cleveland, his law partner, was appointed guardian of Folsom's young daughter, Frances. She used to fondly call him Uncle Steve. Cleveland's real name was actually Stephen, but he felt more comfortable with his middle name, Grover. At any rate, after ascending to the presidency, Cleveland began courting Frances Folsom, the young daughter of Oscar Folsom, and the two married in 1886 in the Blue Room of the White House. Frances Folsom, of course daughter of the president's best friend, became the first woman to be married in the White House, and at 21, 27 years younger than her husband, the nation's youngest ever First Lady. We think there's political scandals today. If TMZ and social media were around in the 1880s, Cleveland would have gone viral with the antics of his personal life. You'd think that all of this would have been viewed as scandalous by Victorian society. On the contrary, people simply could not get enough of the Clevelands. The population fell in love with the story of Grover and his young bride, and she was universally idolized throughout the country. Throngs of crowds would appear to cheer on whenever they traveled. Women would copy her fashions. When Grover Cleveland and family took a cross-country political trip in 1887, he'd sometimes appear at the rear of his railroad car, and people would be courteous to Cleveland for a while, but then they would ask him to bring Frances out because they wanted to cheer her on. He'd explain that she was sleeping, and they said, "Well, okay, you'll do just fine." And Cleveland said, "Well, I suppose of the two of us, we know which one you would favor." His presidential papers also show that he was offered hundreds of invitations to participate in hunting and fishing trips. Fishing clubs asked him to join. Hotel and lodge proprietors sent pamphlets and invites for accommodations at their establishments. One person even sent an elk's head directly to the president as a gift. Maybe he wanted to make Cleveland an offer he couldn't refuse. This was also a time when presidential names and his family names were frequently highlighted in advertisements to create the impression that he somehow endorsed these products, regardless of whether the president had agreed to allow them to use his name or not. The Clevelands had 5 children together. The oldest was Ruth Cleveland, born in 1891. You've probably heard of this presidential child, although you might not be aware of it. Ruth Cleveland, born during the period in between her father's non-consecutive terms, was wildly popular with the public, being called Baby Ruth by the press. She achieved some sort of immortality when the candy maker named the Baby Ruth candy bar after her. According to the Curtis Candy Company, they honored Ruth's enduring popularity by naming the candy bar after her in 1920-1921. 17 years after her premature death in 1904. Although many claim this was actually a subterfuge to capitalize on the popularity of a certain baseball player without paying him any royalties. So what were newspapers like during the period of Grover Cleveland? National and local newspapers pried into the personal lives of citizens for a good story. Articles of that time period seem intrusive to today's readers. Local reporters were dispatched every day to hotels and railroad stations to inquire about the comings and goings of local celebrities and citizens alike. It's not unusual to find the guest registers of these local hotels published in the paper the next day. News of people's medical maladies, operations, conditions, and prospects for recovery were outlined in detail in that pre-HIPAA world. It was impossible to escape the notice of local papers, especially if that visitor was the President of the United States. President Cleveland's name has been associated with the Rendezvous Lodge, of course. That resort was the subject of frequent updates and columns in the local paper. Here are some of the typical articles regarding guests and accommodations at the Rendezvous in Homosassa in 1906. What was Homosassa like during the period of Grover Cleveland? The village was still part of Hernando County when Cleveland first ascended to the office of president. There were at least two major attempts to develop Homosassa as a homesteading destination during Cleveland's time: the Homosassa Land Company and the Homosassa Company. The most successful Homosassa development effort would be undertaken by the Florida West Coast Development Company in 1925. The Homosassa Company and Homosassa Land Company placed large advertisements in the New York papers in the 1880s and 1890s. The ads included a list of prominent men who were investors or visitors to Homosassa. At a time when Grover Cleveland's name was freely appropriated, it's noteworthy that none of these companies listed Cleveland as a partner or a visitor to Homosassa. As a matter of fact, there are no newspaper articles or advertisements during Cleveland's period related to Homosassa during the period 1875 to 1924. The first Cleveland visited Homosassa articles appeared in 1925, coincidentally at the same time when the Florida West Coast Improvement Development Company launched their impressive marketing campaigns to sell Homosassa land to northern investors. Cleveland's papers and writings. President Cleveland's papers are stored in the Library of Congress. Unlike today's world, presidential papers during that time were not fastidiously collected and stored in a safe and secure location. Most of the communications that Cleveland received during his terms were retained by his personal secretaries. Copies of outgoing letters were not usually saved. Up until about 1912, there were no designated repositories for his papers. They were literally stored in boxes in the attics of his widow, Frances Folsom Cleveland, his personal secretaries, his former law partners, and a local New Hampshire historical society in a variety of other locations. When Frances Preston, the remarried Mrs. Cleveland, decided to authorize an official biography of the deceased husband, she forwarded the boxes of official and personal papers from her attic to the selected biographer. She had formerly donated many boxes of papers to the Conway, New Hampshire Historical Society, for the Clevelands had a summer home in Conway, New Hampshire, and they were forwarded to McElroy as well. All of these papers were collected and forwarded to the Library of Congress for long-term storage. I've reviewed the indexes to all of the Cleveland papers over a period of about 6 months. There is not one single document in the Cleveland papers that refers to Homosassa, the rendezvous, or any of the proprietors of the Homosassa resorts during that period. In addition, the official Citrus County archives, where we are today, do not have any record of Grover Cleveland owning any property in Homosassa or anywhere in Citrus County. Finally, when Grover Cleveland passed away in 1908, I would have expected to see an outpouring of grief and detailed articles about his time in Homosassa. Surely, the Citrus County Chronicle or the Ocala Star would have stories about the man who put Homosassa on the map. Checking the minutes of the Citrus County Board of County Commissioners for that date, there was no mention of Cleveland and the pivotal role he played beyond our county. Compare that to the story of Stuart, Florida, on the East Coast. In 1899, Cleveland was passing through that town and his railroad car became uncoupled from the engine. Cleveland was stranded for several hours when he noticed a young man walking near the tracks. Cleveland opened the window of his car and asked, "Where are we? What city are we in?" And the local responded, "You're in Stuart, Florida." Cleveland also noted that the young man was going fishing. So he asked, "What's biting?" So the young man offered to take Cleveland fishing. And the former president grabbed his fishing pole and off he went for a day of fishing with his new friend. Cleveland returned again and again over the years to Stuart and was warmly welcomed by the community. The newspaper stories that reported his death were very different than what we saw in Citrus County. So in conclusion, while it's certainly possible, the overwhelming evidence that we have at this time is that Grover Cleveland did not use Homosassa as his winter White House. He did not build the rendezvous, and most likely did not fish in the Homosassa River for a month at a time. There are no records to support any of these legends. These stories, I feel, were the result of a very creative marketing strategy by a Chicago-based land firm in 1925. So that's all we have today. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Please come down and visit us at one of our 3 museums. We're at the Coastal Heritage Museum in Crystal River, the Floral City Museum down in Floral City, Florida, and in the center of the county here in Inverness, the Old Courthouse Heritage Museum. We hope to see you soon. Thank you.